The wind carried the scent of jasmine and rosemary through the wooden shutters of the small cottage nestled at the foot of the hills. A year had passed since the firestorm of scandal, betrayal, and revelation that once defined Elena's name. Now, she moved through quiet mornings and sun-drenched afternoons with a kind of stillness that could only be earned through surviving chaos. She lived not in a mansion, but in a humble home with clay tiles and a backyard that pulsed with color: roses, lavender, marigolds, and rows of vegetables carefully nurtured by hands that once trimmed aristocratic hedges. Alex was always outside by sunrise. Dirt under his nails, a sun hat shading his tanned face. The same quiet grace he had shown in their first stolen glance. But now, he whistled as he worked, often glancing toward the window where Elena rocked their baby boy, humming lullabies that had no words, only warmth. The child, named Matteo, was full of laughter and light. His eyes, almond-shaped and curious, mirrored Elena's depth, but his mouth curled in the same half-smile that had once disarmed her in a storm-drenched greenhouse. He grew among the herbs and petals, his steps wobbly but determined, his fingers always reaching for life. They didn't have wealth, not anymore, but they had peace, they had truth. And every morning Elena whispered to Matteo, "You were born from a love they couldn't understand. But we do." Elena told him stories under the apricot tree, not of kings or castles, but of seeds, and soil, and a gardener who waited in silence until the flowers taught the world to listen. There were no crowns in her tales, just hands that healed and hearts that remembered. One breezy afternoon, a letter arrived from a solicitor's office. Elena held it with the careful dread of someone used to bad news disguised in formality. She read it twice before speaking. Gregory Callahan was dead, a quiet death in his sleep. The man who had tried to erase both sun and truth had made a final gesture. He left a parcel of land to the child born from the affair. A vineyard, once tended by Gregory's father, abandoned for decades but now passed on to the blood that had once threatened his legacy. Elena didn't cry, she didn't rejoice, she simply folded the letter, pressed it against her lips, and whispered something no one heard. Weeks later, they visited the land. The vines were wild, unruly, wrapped around memories. Alex walked ahead with Matteo on his shoulders, the boy giggling at butterflies and sunbeams. Elena followed slowly, her fingers brushing against old wooden posts, half-buried stones, and weeds that once crowned empire. When they reached the center of the field, Alex knelt. He lowered Matteo to the ground and held him close. "This," he said, voice soft, "was where my grandfather planted hope. And now, so will we." Elena sat beside them, the earth warm beneath her. She looked into Alex's eyes, not the lover she once ran from, but the man who stayed, scarred yet whole, for the first time in years. There was no fear in her gaze, no shadow of shame, only sunlight. Matteo clapped, then laughed aloud, a bright, clear sound that scattered birds into flight. And in that vineyard, where blood had once been a curse, life blossomed from the roots of truth. No longer a scandal, no longer a secret, only a family, finally planted where they could bloom. The plan was supposed to be a dream stitched together with sweat and hope. Violet leaned over the sun-warmed porch rail, eyes fixed on the horizon where the garden melted into open sky. Summer's end was inching closer, but in her heart, something new had begun to bloom, a reckless possibility wrapped in Luke's calloused hands and quiet eyes. She told herself it wasn't just lust. It was rebirth, the kind of aching, dangerous resurrection that only came when a woman had been too long unloved. Her plan was simple: sell the old cottage she had inherited in Vermont, take the cash, disappear with Luke, start fresh in a place where no one knew the name Callahan or the taste of money thickened with control. Luke had hesitated when she first brought it up. That hesitation lingered in the way his brow folded like an unread letter. But Violet was persistent. She painted a picture of a simple life, a garden of their own, a house with a red door, a room where no one screamed in silence. And one night, when the moon was fat and the air smelled of cut grass and sweat. Luke finally whispered, "You're the first person who ever made me want to stay." They sealed it with a kiss in the tool shed, surrounded by rakes and dirt and a shared longing. Violet felt 16 again, dangerous, desired, alive. They found an old car together, a rust-tinged sedan parked behind the bar owned by one of Violet's high school friends. She paid cash, no names, no questions. The car waited like a coiled secret in that lot for 3 weeks while they prepared. Every morning, Violet smiled wider. Every evening, she counted the days. Then Charles came home. He arrived 2 weeks early, with no warning and no explanation. Walked through the front door with the same slow confidence he wore at board meetings and charity galas. He kissed Violet on the cheek like a man who hadn't spent months abroad. Sat down at the dining room table. Asked about dinner, smiled. It was wrong. Violet felt it immediately, like a draft under a locked door. She studied him, waiting for questions, accusations, a flicker of suspicion, but nothing came. Charles was smooth, controlled, even charming. He made jokes over dessert. Asked about the garden. That night, Violet whispered her doubts to Luke. In the quiet corner of the greenhouse, she said, "Something's off. He knows. He has to." Luke shook his head, fingers brushing her cheek. "He doesn't see you, Violet. He never did. That's why you're here with me. We're safe." She wanted to believe him. The next morning, they took a photo together. It was the first and only one. Violet framed it in her mind, his arm around her waist. Her hair tangled from the wind. Their smiles awkward and wide. She printed a copy, folded it into her diary. That night, she wrote a letter, not to Luke, to Charles. "You don't love me, and I don't fear you anymore. I am leaving." She placed it in an envelope, sealed it with her initials, and left it under his whiskey decanter. Then she packed, not much, a few clothes, cash, her mother's jewelry, heirloom pieces untouched by Charles's greed. She touched each one before tucking it away, as if asking for permission. Luke came late, dirt still on his sleeves. He kissed her hands first, then her mouth, then her stomach. "Tomorrow," he said, "we drive until the world forgets our names." And Violet, for the first time in years, believed in a tomorrow she could touch. Neither of them saw the car bomb beneath the rusted sedan. Not that night, not yet. The flowers they had watered that evening glistened in moonlight, as if weeping for what morning would take away. The sky was still a shade too dark for dawn when Violet stepped out of the house for what she believed would be the last time. Her heels clicked softly on the driveway, muffled by the fog that hugged the early morning streets. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, only the kind of quiet determination that had been blooming inside her all summer. In her bag were a few essentials: cash, a toothbrush, her mother's pearl brooch, and a small envelope addressed to Charles. The alley was silent, a forgotten sliver of the city behind a mechanic's yard. Luke stood there waiting beside the car, a battered old Volvo with dented doors and dusty windows. He looked different in the half-light, not like a lover or a fantasy, but like someone on the verge of something permanent. He didn't move when he saw her, just smiled, faint and tired, like he already knew how this would end. Violet slid into the passenger seat, placing her hand gently on his leg. There was a pause, not long, but heavy. The key was already in the ignition. She turned to Luke, expecting a whisper, a joke, something to break the tension. He only said, "Are you ready?" She nodded. Her fingers reached for the key. Then came the sound. The kind of sound that ends sentences and silences futures. A blast tore through the alley like thunder confined to one breathless second. The fireball bloomed upward and outward, turning steel into smoke and glass into stars. Windows shattered across the block. Alarms screamed into the silence that followed. And the old Volvo was reduced to nothing but ash, metal, and questions. By the time the authorities arrived, there was little to piece together. 2 bodies, burned beyond recognition, no movement, no survivors. The tags on the car matched the plates registered to Violet's deceased uncle. The VIN number was unreadable. The police suspected a fuel leak. The media framed it as a tragic accident, two lovers running away. Lost to mechanical fate. Charles, composed in a navy suit and dark sunglasses, stood beside a pair of caskets at the memorial held 3 days later. He gave a brief eulogy, voice cracking once. He placed a single white rose on Violet's casket, then stood still long enough for the cameras to catch the tear that rolled from his eye. It made the evening news. But 3 blocks from the explosion, grainy CCTV footage told a different story. The timestamp showed 5:06 a.m. The same alley, the same car. Luke opened the driver's door, glanced toward the camera, just for a moment, and stepped out. He walked away, calmly, purposefully, not toward the city or the street, toward the darkness. 7 seconds later, the car exploded. The footage was archived, not aired. A detective labeled it a technical inconsistency. The file disappeared from the public database within a week. Luke was never seen again. No bank withdrawals, no hotel records, no passport scans. It was as if he had never existed. But Violet's face lived on news feeds, in gossip columns, a cautionary tale, a rich man's wife who chased love and met fire. No one asked what she had been running from, only what she had run into. In the silence that followed, Charles's empire grew, shares rose, insurance paid out, sympathy turned to respect, and in the garden behind the mansion, the roses bloomed that year brighter than ever before. No one noticed that Violet's favorite flower, an obscure hybrid of ivory and crimson, had been removed from the beds entirely. As if she had never touched the soil. As if she had never been there at all. The media painted Charles as a man of impossible strength, a betrayed husband mourning with dignity. Turning grief into philanthropy, he gave interviews, held Violet's hand in framed photos, told stories of their early years together, how she loved lavender tea and old French movies. "I forgive her," he said, his voice breaking just enough for the audience to ache. "Love makes us blind sometimes. I only wish she had come back to me." Behind the curtain of sympathy, a different kind of performance unfolded. Within weeks of Violet's death, Charles collected the full payout from her life insurance policy, $12 million wired into a series of offshore accounts. The media didn't question the speed of the transfer or the unusually high value of the policy. Nor did they wonder how quickly the house in Vermont, the same one Violet had planned to escape to, was sold. Under the authorization of a mysterious legal representative, whose name had never appeared before in any family documentation. But not everyone accepted the fairy tale of a grieving widower. A private investigator, operating under an alias and employed by an unnamed source, began digging. What he found was buried deep in the archives of Charles's past, old employee rosters, financial misconduct, and a name that should have raised alarms. Luke, or rather, Lucas Thornwell, had once worked for Charles, not as a gardener but as a junior financial consultant. Years ago, Lucas had been quietly dismissed after a minor scandal involving manipulated numbers and a misplaced $40. Charges were never filed. The affair vanished into silence. But the man hadn't. In a fireproof safe in Charles's private office, unlocked under dubious circumstances, the investigator found correspondence. Letters, emails, one note, hand-scrawled and yellowed with time, said only, "The gardener angle is perfect. She won't suspect." There were also wire transfers, modest, but regular, sent to Lucas over the course of months. Their frequency increased shortly before Violet's death. In one encrypted message, Charles had written, "Just make sure the story ends clean." When subpoenaed, Charles appeared in court with an army of lawyers and a placid smile. But the file that held the key documents, correspondence, wire logs, even Lucas's fake references, went missing from the evidence locker. No chain of custody, no explanation. Charles returned to his mansion untouched. Reputation scrubbed clean. The press labeled the hearing a baseless attack by conspiracy theorists. In an interview days later, he leaned into the camera, eyes cold behind reading glasses. "Some people," he said, don't know how to stay in their place. He meant Violet. He meant Lucas. He meant anyone foolish enough to believe the flowers in his garden grew without blood beneath the roots. The mansion sat empty, its windows like blank eyes, watching nothing and no one. After the hearings and the storm of media attention, Charles quietly sold the estate and vanished from American soil. Some said he relocated to Monaco, where money glides easier and questions are never asked twice. No one followed. No one cared. The house, once pulsing with secrets and trimmed hedges, now wore dust like an overcoat. The garden, once Violet's sanctuary, decayed. The trellises she used to walk beneath sagged under dead vines. The roses that once blazed with color now hung their heads, petals browned and falling. The hybrid blooms she had cultivated, the ivory crimson varietals named for memories only she cherished, withered in the soil. No gardener left to whisper them into life. No one returned to water. No one returned to grieve. And then, a year later, on an afternoon split by wind and sun, a young woman with a camera slung over her shoulder happened to wander past. She had no name worth mentioning, just a love for forgotten places and the pull of decayed beauty. The mansion drew her in like a song from another life. She crept through the iron gate, stepped lightly over cracked stones, and entered the skeletal garden. There, on a moss-covered bench, she saw something out of place, a bouquet. Fresh, delicate stems tied with twine, blooms pale and red, as if dipped in guilt. They sat in the center of the bench like an apology. Beneath the bouquet was a slip of paper, soft with dew, on which was scrawled in fading ink, "Forgive the bloom. It never wanted to be born here." She took the flowers, brought them back to her flat and pressed them in a book. A week later, a botanist friend said the flowers were unlike anything he'd seen, a hybrid undocumented in public records. A rumor began to spread among online forums that the flowers came from the garden of the dead wife. Whispers swirled that a woman had died in fire, that a gardener had vanished, that the blooms had memory. Not long after, news broke: Charles was dead. A stroke. In a hotel room in Monte Carlo. No one claimed the body for days. When the embassy finally arranged a burial, no one came. The press, once hungry for his quotes, published one short line: financier Charles W. Eaton, 64. Died abroad. No known survivors. But there were sightings. In a seaside town across the world. Near a fish market and ferry docks. A florist sold rare blooms from the back of a bicycle cart. His hair was longer, his beard thicker, he spoke little, smiled less. The cart always had one flower, a soft ivory base with crimson veins like roots. The children called him the ghost gardener. No one knew his real name. But one child swore he heard the man humming once, a song about rain and ashes. The story ends where all stories do, with a place that no one visits, a garden choked by time, and a final line, carved into a broken sundial among the dead petals. Some gardens don't grow flowers. They grow ghosts.